You ever see someone dig their own grave with a smile on their face? That was Karen. And no, not just any Karen. This was HOA Karen, the unofficial queen of complaints in our quiet little neighborhood. But today she picked the wrong target. She thought my grandpa was just some harmless old man renting a cabin on the edge of town. She didn't know he's the very reason this county even runs. And by the time she found out, it was already way too late. It all started the day my grandpa moved back to Willow Bend after retiring. He wanted peace, quiet, a little land, a porch to sip his sweet tea on. You know, old man goals. He picked a small but charming house that backed up to the woods. Technically, it was on the edge of the HOA boundaries, barely included, but that detail would become real important later. The house had been empty for years, so when he moved in, folks were curious. But Grandpa, he was polite, waved at everyone, kept to himself, fixed up the garden, and even repaired the old white fence that had been falling apart since 2009. Everyone liked him, everyone except Karen. She lived 3 houses down with her binoculars, clipboard, and a sour face that looked like it was carved out of a lemon. Her entire personality revolved around one thing: rules. She ran the HOA board like a dictator, constantly, handing out warnings for grass being too wild, trash cans being too visible, or, my personal favorite, mailboxes that were insufficiently patriotic. And so, of course, when Grandpa's pickup truck didn't match the approved neutral color palette for residential vehicles, she was on him like bees on honey. She showed up on his porch one morning holding a printed packet titled Violation. Notice Showdowns. That should have been our first clue this wasn't going to be a one-time thing. "Hello there," she said with that tight smile people only wear when they're about to ruin your day. "I'm Karen, president of the Willow Bend HOA. I noticed your truck doesn't quite meet the visual standards outlined in our community guidelines." Grandpa looked down at her over his reading glasses and replied with a grin, "It's a 1968 Ford. It's part of the American Visual Standard." Karen didn't laugh. Instead, she handed over the packet and walked away like she'd just served a court summons. Grandpa chuckled, but I could see the wheels turning in his head. He wasn't rattled. He was patient. But Karen? She kept escalating. The next week, she filed a noise complaint, said Grandpa's old country music was audible from the sidewalk, even though he only played it during the day and never loud. Then came the grass length issue. Exceeds HOA limits by 0.5 inches. Mind you, Grandpa had just mowed it. Then the porch furniture. Unapproved color. The chairs were walnut brown. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was on a mission. I visited Grandpa more often just to keep him company. One evening, I caught him sitting on the porch, sipping sweet tea, flipping through the HOA handbook with a grin. "You good, Pops?" I asked. "Oh yeah," he said, tapping the booklet. "Just studying up on my favorite comedy novel." But Karen wasn't laughing. A month in, she marched up his driveway again, this time flanked by 2 other HOA board members who looked like they didn't really want to be there. "This is your final warning," she declared. "You're out of compliance with multiple regulations. If you don't correct the issues, we'll begin the eviction process." Grandpa set down his tea slowly. "Eviction?" he repeated calmly. "Yes," Karen said. "The HOA has the right to remove tenants who refuse to comply." Now this was wild. The house was bought outright, paid in full by Grandpa. No mortgage, no rent. Eviction? Not legally possible. But Karen was too deep in her own power trip to care. I stepped forward, but Grandpa held up a hand. He stood up, slowly brushed off his shirt, and said, "Tell you what, Karen, I'll see you at the next HOA meeting. Sound fair?" Karen smirked like she'd just won. "Oh, I'll be there," she said, spinning on her heels. What she didn't know, and what I was dying to tell her, was that Grandpa wasn't just some friendly old man with a passion for sweet tea. He used to be the county administrator for 24 years. Before that, he served 2 terms as sheriff, and before that, he was on the planning and zoning board that approved the very bylaws this HOA twisted to their liking. He helped write the original neighborhood ordinances. He knew every loophole, every clause, and every person still working in the local government, but he didn't say a word. He just waited. The next HOA meeting was the storm before the calm. Karen opened with her usual over-the-top roll call and motions, clearly gearing up for a motion to evict. She had a folder in front of her stacked with complaints, photos, and what looked like drone footage of Grandpa's backyard. Not even kidding. Then Grandpa walked in, clean button-up, nice slacks, clipboard in hand, calm, confident, heads turned, people whispered. Karen tried to keep control. "Sir, I'm afraid this meeting is for HOA members only." Grandpa cut in. "I am a member. I own property in this HOA, full rights. Here's my deed." He handed it over. She hesitated, then turned red. He continued, "I'd also like to submit my application to run for HOA board." Gasps. Literal gasps. Someone whispered, That's Tom Whitaker, right?" Grandpa smiled. "Nice to see some of you remember." Karen tried to regain control. "You still have multiple violations." Grandpa turned to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to remind you that most of the violations cited are based on amendments passed without full membership votes, and many of them are inconsistent with county codes which override HOA bylaws per Section 9B of the Charter. Also, you can't evict a homeowner without cause, and I'd love to see how that holds up in court." Silence. Karen looked like she'd swallowed a lemon whole. "And as of this morning," he added, "I've spoken with County Commissioner Davis, and we'll be reviewing Willow Bend's HOA policies for compliance. This includes financial audits and voting procedures. I'd like to request a pause on enforcement actions until then." He sat down, and that's when Karen lost it. "You think you can walk in here and—" Someone stood up. "I second Mr. Whitaker's motion." Another. "I vote in favor." Hands went up. Karen's grip slipped faster than a cheap wig in a windstorm, and just like that, the tide turned. You could hear a pin drop after Grandpa made his statement at that HOA meeting. Karen sat frozen, clutching her folder of so-called violations like it was going to save her. But it wouldn't. Because the moment Grandpa spoke, the entire board and the neighborhood realized they weren't dealing with some harmless retiree anymore. They were dealing with the man who ran this county for decades. The very next day, things started shifting. Fast. First, Grandpa's motion to pause all HOA enforcement. Actions passed by a wide margin. Turns out, a lot of the residents had been quietly fed up with Karen's regime for years, but no one wanted to speak up. Why? Because Karen ran the board like a high school clique mixed with a reality TV villain. If you crossed her, suddenly, your garbage was non-compliant, your house paint was unauthorized, or your dog's bark was too aggressive. But with Grandpa now running for a seat on the board and his credentials out in the open, people started speaking freely. Neighbors approached him in his driveway. Tom, I didn't realize it was you. You helped get my son that zoning exemption years ago. You ran emergency services like clockwork. And she's trying to kick you out? One guy even said, if you run for HOA president, I'll campaign door to door. Myself. Word spread like wildfire. And Karen? She wasn't handling it well. She doubled down, pushing out more violation notices to Grandpa, trying to prove she still held power. But each one was shredded calmly and legally with citations from the original county code. Codes Grandpa had helped write. Then came the audit. Grandpa wasn't bluffing when he said the county commissioner would look into things. And 3 weeks. Later, the HOA board received a formal notice. A full review was being launched into financial irregularities, voting procedures, and bylaw amendments. Turns out Karen had been bending the rules to her benefit for years. Like that new security camera system the HOA paid $18,000 for. It was installed by her cousin's company, and several cameras were mysteriously pointed at neighbors she didn't like, or that community improvement grant she got for landscaping. It was used to pave her backyard patio. She claimed she held monthly votes. Turns out no one outside her inner circle even knew they were happening, and here's where it gets juicy. The treasurer of the HOA, he was a nervous, quiet guy named Fred. Karen always spoke over him, but once the investigation began, Fred came forward. He spilled everything. She told me to just sign and not ask questions, he confessed. Said it was for the good of the neighborhood. The financial trail was worse than anyone expected. HOA dues had been mishandled for years, thousands unaccounted for. When the residents got wind of it, they were furious. A special meeting was called. Karen showed up, still trying to put on that smug expression, but it looked cracked around the edges. Her voice shook slightly as she called the meeting to order. Grandpa sat front row, calm, silent. Then the commissioner's office rep stood up and presented the findings. Misappropriation of funds, unapproved procedural amendments, abuse of authority. Every point hit like a hammer. The board members who once backed Karen turned their backs one by one. And when it came time to vote, unanimous. Karen was removed from her position. Effective immediately, the room burst into cheers, not just polite applause, real, loud, vindicated applause. Karen, she stormed out, head down. Folder clenched in her hand like a lifeline, but no one followed her this time. The queen of the HOA was dethroned, and who took her place? You guessed it, Grandpa. But here's where it gets even better. He didn't want to keep the power. He accepted the role of interim president with one goal, to fix everything Karen broke. First, he rewrote the bylaws with full transparency. Every resident was given a copy. Every change was voted on publicly. He refunded as much of the misused HOA funds as possible and reduced dues for the next year. He also introduced a volunteer program that allowed seniors to contribute time to community projects in exchange for dues discounts. And that drone footage Karen used to spy on people? Gone. Permanently banned. Cameras removed. Privacy restored. The neighborhood breathed again. I remember asking Grandpa one afternoon, "So, what now? You gonna keep running the HOA like a one-man army?" He chuckled. "Son, I didn't move back here to run anything. I moved here for peace and sweet tea. But you've got the whole neighborhood behind you now." He nodded. "And now that they see what real leadership looks like, I don't need to be in charge. I just needed to remind them of their voice." That's when he announced he was stepping down as HOA president, but not before creating a new rule: term limits and democratic elections. No more dictatorships, no more power-hungry Karens. The neighborhood held its first open election in a decade. And who won? Not Grandpa. It was Mrs. Alvarez, a retired school principal who'd lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years. She'd never dared run before, too afraid of Karen's wrath. But now, she stood proudly on the community stage, thanked Grandpa for paving the way, and promised to serve with fairness and humility. And Grandpa? He finally got his piece. He returned to his porch, music low, tea in hand. The only thing Karen left behind was a faded violation notice Doberhausen 1 crumpled in the grass. One afternoon, a kid rode by on his bike and waved. "Hey, Mr. Whitaker, thanks for saving the neighborhood." Grandpa just tipped his hat. "No problem, son." And that, my friends, is the story of how one retired man with a porch and a past turned a tyrant's reign into a lesson in real leadership. Karen thought she could push out a quiet old man. But she had no idea. He ran the whole county. And, now, he runs the neighborhood without running it at all.